beginning of a busy day, and I have to say that, you know, the workload, it changes so drastically over time and kind of comes in waves. So as you're growing, if you don't keep up in all the kind of areas, or if you don't grow kind of uniformly, then all of a sudden you come into moments where, you know, workload gets really, really heavy. We're definitely in one of those right now where, you know, we came into this place, we're moving into the busy time of year, and we need more help around here. So in the meantime, every day kind of you have to drum up the desire to level up and make more yourself, you know. So today I'm looking at this walk-in, and there is a lot to do. So my first part of the day is just kind of trying to get order from what I'm seeing. Got a bunch of different things I need to look at, mostly just look at communications from the team members, because I'm here alone right now. Of course, this is far more product than somebody can possibly do by themselves. We've been making this over the course of a few days, and so now, you know, we're kind of getting to the culmination point of the week, and most of this product's going to get baked off. So you know, it's all weekend stuff. By the time we start next week, we're going to be starting again from nothing, from just a small amount of sourdough starter to kick off the week. So going into today, I have to kind of organize my workflow. I have to decide what equipment do I need to turn on, what products need to start passively doing something, and what am I actually actively going to be working on. And then I have to take all the things that I'm actively working on and put them into the correct order. It's freezing in here, so anytime I come in here, we think about that, it gets really warm in the bakery. It's kind of nice to walk into the walk-in for a minute or two, and then you realize, wow, it gets really cold in there. So today I've got pastries that I need to proof. I noticed that I have bins of dough that are meant for English muffins that I need to roll out. I think one. I have baguettes that I need to divide and make and shape. I of course have bread to bake. And then there's also sandwich bread that needs to come into the proofer. So before I put anything in the proofer, just going to double check we're empty in there. And I'm going to turn it on. So right now it's just an ambient room, just literally an extension of the bakery. You can see the tile floor, whatnot. It's just an insulated room. But what I'm about to do is inject heat and humidity into the room to bring it to the mid-80s and bring the humidity level up into a high level as well, about 80%. From there, it's going to create a perfect environment for proofing sourdough. Our sandwich bread is going to go in there and start its final proof before the bake. And the first batch of croissants that we bake, actually for basically afternoon service today. We have some baked off overnight for morning service, and now we're going to roll into afternoon service for our grocery store. Our shop today isn't open yet, so we're still basically kind of in waves right now. We are opening one day at a time, testing things like testing coffee or testing tea or testing a particular type of customer flow as we hire, as we staff. So now that I have the proofer on, I don't have to worry about baking off fresh for customers today. More worried about our overall kind of production for distribution. I had turned the ovens on some time ago. That was actually the true first thing I did when I came in this morning, but to catch me then, you would have to wake up much, much earlier. Really, this day started with me coming in here while it was still dark, taking some time for myself to actually read. No one really bothers me that time of day. But of course, turn on the oven as well. This oven has a auto start function where you can program it to come on at a particular time. None of us around here have taken the time to figure out how to use it yet, because we're too busy making all the bread that you just saw in the cooler. So one of these days we'll take a moment to study the manual and figure it out. I'm going to take kind of a final pass through the bakery and just notice if anything is out of place. Also take a mental note of things that I need to delegate to my teammate who will be coming in shortly to work with me. We do have actually some media folks coming out today for, it's actually turned out to be kind of an interesting morning. It's storming at the garage, yet kind of clipped us off, so like really dark clouds in the sky over downtown Mesa. We've got one of the major media outlets coming out this morning to basically do a segment for I Love Mesa Day, which is tomorrow here. It's like this special event happening in the downtown Mesa district, and all these buildings will be doing various things, to participate. We're actually going to be baking off these I Love Mesa loaves with stencils that one of our crew members, Emerald, made. So she makes these really interesting bread-specific stencils. Of course, like any stencil that you find that's of a suitable size could potentially be used to stencil bread, but some of them are of a weird form factor to actually do it in practice. Like they're awkward to place on a loaf of bread. So when she makes these, she makes them, with baking in mind. And we asked her to make some stencils to celebrate this I Love Mesa Day. So anyway, we got to also get this place ready for the fact that there's going to be a media shot. Despite not opening for customers, I noticed, like always, got to wipe down that pastry top, got to clear some of this clutter, and put away some of the plates that we have cleaned over there. Probably roll that speed rack. So just making a mental list before I get going on all the major tasks of the day. We're going to go from basically working on the oven to also working on the table. And so I want to also think about what order of operations I'm going to go in the oven. In this case, I've got English muffins that I need to roll out today. I'm going to pull the rack of ready-to-bake English muffins that will be replaced with rolled-out English muffins right away. So I'm kind of thinking about workflow since I'm by myself. Normally, we'd probably have somebody working on the table and somebody else working on the oven at the very least. Today, I'm kind of bouncing around and working on it all. So now that all the equipment is on that needs to be on, I'm going to start actually moving things into the proofer that belong here today. First step is the sandwich bread. When you're dealing with long fermentation cycles, we have kind of aging product, I suppose you could say, in the walk-in. Product that was shaped late last night can be carried over till tomorrow's bake. And so we have sandwich bread that was made one cycle sooner that's being baked today, and I've got one more rack of it at the very least. You can see that these sandwich loaves right now are very small in comparison to the size of the vessel that they're in. You can still see the butter around the pan, and by the time I go to bake them, they will actually fill this tin. Now, I visually actually know where they need to be in order to produce the size of sandwich bread that I want. So for me, I far prefer using sight and touch as the senses for judging final proof rather than just time. Recipes are often written, okay, do a final proof for X amount of hours. And that's fine, I suppose, but it doesn't really factor the fact that we're dealing with living microorganisms in this process. And so it might just be that on one day the timing changes by a factor of even a couple of hours. I rely on my visual and my visual sense and my sense of touch over just a blanket time for that reason, because I can produce a quality result every single time, understanding what I'm visually going for. So that solves my problem with sandwich bread. The other thing I'm looking out for is a varied pastry set that we usually do for the afternoon bake today. And so in this case, I've got a tray of chocolate, a couple trays of sourdough croissants, I've got a couple trays of almonds, and a few trays of Danish. So already pretty varied there. I can couple that with these morning buns. The rest of these pastries are actually all going to go into their proof and bake cycle today as well, but not until much later, because the pastries here won't be baked off until late tonight, so that basically they come out of the oven and go almost straight onto the delivery truck for the farmers markets. So we're basically just grabbing some afternoon inventory for ourselves. And so now that process has started, along with the sandwich process. Now these processes are hours and hours in length. In fact, this might be my only role in this particular set of products' life, because by the time we go to bake them, others will be here working. This is the bread that we're going to be working on the table. And what I want to do is find the English muffins. We only have so many speed racks, and many of them are in use. I don't really want to add another one. So these muffins were separated out for our Sunday bake. This dough can actually take a few days in this cold environment before it needs to be baked. And so basically they were set to be baked tomorrow. I have one bin though of muffins that's newer. So instead, this is now going to become basically later product, the Sunday product that's baked Saturday night. And this will now become product that's baked today for basically packaging later on and delivery, which is kind of the next thing we have coming up. Because basically these amount of trays will perfectly be replaced by this dough. So if I bake these right now, I basically can just immediately put new trays of English muffins on board here and roll this guy right back in. I'm just going to grab these other few items off that are basically being left behind. I don't really mind the sandwich bread being on board because it has such a long proof cycle that by the time I get it back in here, it will have done no harm to me. But these extras, I don't need them with me. So we're gonna work on those muffins momentarily, and I'm gonna get these baking right away. I don't really have to get the rest of my oven workflow put together quite yet. So I'm gonna put 2 trays on my loader, drop down to the very bottom deck here. It's heated up to 420 degrees, and the heat distribution is the vast majority coming up from the bottom, the stone. It's a 90-10 ratio stone to ambient heat. And no steam or anything like that. In fact, the steam damper is in its open position over there. I'm just going to basically slide these 2 trays in. Bring my loader back to working height. And slide the next 2 trays in as well, right next door. Meanwhile, we're going to get straight to actually making these English muffins. Basically, I'm making 120 English muffins, and they are 3 inches by 3 inches. So depending on how many I'm making, it's going to depend on the size that I need to flour on the table. In this case, it is 45 inches by 24 inches. I'm going to buffer that by 1 inch on either side, so 46 inches by 25 inches is the rectangle of dough that I want to create. I want to basically bring that rectangle out on a heavily floured surface because this is a fairly wet, almost brioche style dough, and it will stick to the surface of the table otherwise while I'm rolling it out. So this would be similar to like a ciabatta workflow where a floured surface is your friend. So I've got plenty of flour there and distance. I'm basically going to just draw my square now, a rectangle. Great, so that's the box that basically the dough needs to wind up in. Now I'm going to take this dough, which is in a bin, free the lid, which now has a little dough on it, which has kind of grown into it. Not a big deal. This dough has been cold fermenting, and I'm going to plop it into the middle. I'm kind of using my hand like a spatula on the edges of the bin to release the dough evenly. You can tell it's not super sticky because it's risen, but it's a pretty wet dough, and you can see that, you know, there's moisture to it. So basically, to make my life a lot easier when handling it, I'm also going to flour the top with an ample amount. Doughs that utilize flour like this through their workflow will take on certain characteristics. We don't use a heavy flour workflow on our artisan sourdough, as an example. Mostly use water, but you can kind of tell, like when you eat at ciabatta, you can sort of see the remnants of the flour dusting that ciabatta got, and I think that it ends up becoming a desirable feature in the bread. In this case, you're not going to see it like that because by the time I'm done handling this this dough on the table, by the time I go to cut out all 120, a surprising amount of the flour will be soaked up into the dough. So now I'm basically gently rolling out. I'm applying a lot of downward and horizontal pressure, both, and I don't mind actually leaning into my rolling pin. I think a lot of people think that they kind of only can use the handles of the rolling pin. It's one of the reasons I don't really love the rolly handle rolling pins. So you're kind of stuck in this motion, and it's actually not the way that I like rolling out dough. I like using a little bit more of my body weight. Makes it easier to roll out evenly, and also is a better use of my energy, I think. So I'm trying to create squared English muffins, which means I'm sort of rolling this out in a squared fashion. If I roll, I'm also being mindful of how I'm rolling it out. So it's already fairly even in its rollout. And as I get further and further, I want to preserve the evenness. So I'm not going to just press forcefully down in one spot and then roll, but rather I'm going to kind of assess the dough as I go and try to evenly lengthen it out to the size of my box. One of the ways I'm doing this right now is just simply switching from side to side. I'm also watching the corners and seeing, is the whole side dragging kind of evenly. And you can take a cue from other baking processes. For me, this is not all that dissimilar to what's happening when I'm laminating croissant dough. And so I've watched thousands of sheets of croissant dough be rolled out through the sheeter, and before that was rolling them out manually myself. And it's kind of the same process of sort of gently and evenly rolling out. So in a sheeter, you have like even pressure from both sides. When you're rolling manually, you have to try to simulate that even pressure. One of the ways in which I can sort of create a reset, and it's the one tool I didn't grab that I also need for this particular product, is a straight edge. And watch that be the thing that sends me to the back room. Today's kind of a light day, so I don't really need all of this up there right now. But I will take these two. All right, so back to it, and now I have the straight edge. What I'm gonna actually do is narrow my dough a little bit with it. Basically bump it in line with my outline. It's actually slightly narrower than my outline. Trying to kind of get it back to the width of my rolling pin in this case, so I can get some more even rollouts. I can always widen it towards the end, but now it's basically the width of my rolling pin. I have a matter of just a few inches on either side to still lengthen the dough, and more or less a fairly even plane of dough. So I still want to kind of maintain the even method of rolling it out. Just going to take it through the whole length and press it out a few more inches on either end. So again, I'm applying downward pressure as I'm rolling. Now I'm a little bit further, but I'm noticing that the center is moving and the sides are not. I'm going to take from the center of this end to develop this corner. So basically pressing this corner out. And I'm going to do the same to the other three corners. Very, very close now to basically having all of the lines surpassed by my block of dough. And what I'm doing is just finding any unevenness and resolving that now before I do kind of the final touches of my square English muffins. So everything I had on the table up until now was truly just a guide. That's my 1 minute warning that it's almost time to check on the muffins that are currently baking. But I have this rolled out, and it's fine to pause for a minute while I do that. I only need 46, so I'm going to make a mark in the dough on either end, just to give myself an understanding. And I only need 25, which is pretty much what I've got. I'm not going to really mess with it that much on those ends yet. But now I can bump in this end and create a straighter edge. So that 13-minute timer that I set it conservatively for myself. You often think of timers as being something like, I'm going to set it to the exact end point of an event, but even though the oven has this 1 minute warning feature, I actually add a whole nother 2 minute buffer because usually I'm baking multiple decks at a time. So if I miss that timer, I want time to get there because I might be loading another deck at the moment, or in this case, I might be working on dough on the table. So yes, it's ringing, but we have time to get to it and address it without fear of burning. Putting my loader into the unload mode. dropping it down to the deck where the English muffins live, and sort of gently and evenly bringing the unloader in and under the sheet trays and pulling them out. Looks like a good amount that we caught. We'll see the bottoms here. So now I'm going to flip all these muffins. And they don't quite have a whole lot of color on the bottom yet, which is fine by me. Our hydrations are still a little bit out of whack on some of our products. The sourdough starter recently changed. Also, the environment's slightly different. The bake environment is different than it was in our home garage. So we're still, one of the things that we've been struggling with is English muffins basically getting stuck to the pans and not wanting to flip. We don't think that it's a matter of not using enough semolina, which is the dusting flour that we're using underneath these muffins. Semolina is actually the same flour that is a similar flour that you'd find in pastas. It's made with durum wheat. So I'm getting a little bit of color on some of these, which is kind of ideal. The ones that have no color might need another flip. And since I'm kind of working with these one oven deck at a time right now, that's okay if I need to flip them a second time. But really, it's best when you get just a little bit of color so that you only have to flip them the one time in their bake cycle. Basically putting these right back in on the other side, so they've all been flipped now. And I'm going to unload their siblings next door. This particular oven load looks pretty much ideal. So this is the exact color that I'm really wanting on the flip. I love it when they don't stick because flipping them is just infinitely faster. Just got to be careful when you're doing this because everything around you is hot. The sheet trays are hot. I have sheet tray oven burns right now on my arms to show for it. Nothing quite like a sheet tray burn. It's worse than like touching the stone of the oven. Somehow touching the metal, the hot metal, is just hits you worse. I'm sure somebody has an explanation for that. I haven't looked into why. Okay, loading these right back in now. And now I'm just setting a 5-minute timer. It's not a huge amount of time. It's really just enough time for the other side to get a beautiful little circle of color on the muffins and for them to complete their bake on the inside. I'm going to check my final measure. We are in a good spot there. And we're in a decent spot here too. So now I'm going to open up this tool, the bicicleta, to 3 inches on each of these segments. So now I'm just scoring this dough. I'm going to run all the way down the length and separate all the strips that will become individual English muffins first. I'm going to come back around and do this side now. So now the squares are showing up for the first time. This is again just a guide because I still control where I cut this dough. So I have a fairly even plane. I have 120 squares scored on that plane. And now I'm going to proceed to my pizza wheel to basically remove or separate all these muffins. The moment that I cut, I'm releasing the tension that's built in the dough. While I was rolling out, I was trying to roll out in a way to minimize any accumulated tension. The more that you roll the dough out in any way, you're basically stretching it and creating tension. You can stretch it the other way to counter it. what you're trying to avoid is creating so much tension to where when you cut the dough, it starts to like stretch back, like snapback effect. I cut the little scrap here just to test, and there's not really any kind of a snapback effect right now. That's a good thing. I'm going to let it rest since we're about to change out that oven that we have going. Basically going to load up the other English muffins that will follow in the next oven load. Meanwhile, giving this a chance to relax some more, and we'll just cut it out. So I need the other rack of muffins, the one that I'm going to be baking primarily through the morning now. This one needs to be baked in full today. And I'm going to need my mitts. Mitts over time will just develop holes from the heat. If you notice this, they're not completely useless because you can use the other side, but you do have to be careful putting them on so as to not expose that hole. Pretty decent color. This other tray is going to be probably even nicer. Yeah, this one's pretty much a picture perfect finish here. You have a little bit of color, those like little bit of this like colored ring that is created on the one side, and a nice golden brown bottom. These muffins are so nice as a bread. Particularly like them for burgers and sandwiches. They're really my favorite for that kind of a thing. Basically going straight into the next bake here of muffins. So now this rack is the one that is going to accept these muffins from the table that will end up back in the walk-in cooler. I mentioned that the sandwich bread that is on this rack was kind of fine to wheel around with me. It's going to bake tomorrow, and giving it a little bit of time in the warmer environment doesn't hurt. It's still got a long proof. Again, I'm going to judge it visually, so it doesn't actually really matter if it's a little bit further ahead right now. I'll be here to find the end of that proof. So now I'm going to cut these out. The minute I cut them out, I'm going to tray them up on 5 trays. So might as well prep the sheet trays that I need. These get dusted with semolina. So semolina from that durum wheat's got this yellow color to it. And I can actually put the sheet trays right where they're going to end up living on this speed rack. So I'm kind of putting an ample amount of semolina just because of that sticking problem that we've had recently, where the muffins are sticking to the bottom of the pan. There's other potential solutions, like we could switch from semolina to bran. Bran is even more moisture absorbent than semolina is. Bran is kind of that outer coating of a wheat berry, and if you think about it, it's kind of makes sense that it's good at absorbing moisture. It's literally what it does in nature. The outer, or protecting from moisture rather, creates a moisture barrier. So in other words, it's like this surface that if it's moist around, it won't allow the moisture to penetrate. So it's more modular on that surface. It doesn't stick to it. And both of those things are important when working with bread. You don't want the loaf to stick to the bottom of the oven when you're baking. That will cause it to blacken on the very, very bottom and make it really hard to remove. So it's one of the reasons why we use things like semolina, or in our case, wheat bran. A lot of people use things like cornmeal to accomplish the same. We don't use cornmeal in our bakery. It's a decision we made. We didn't find a need to introduce a whole nother type of product, which for some is a potential allergen. So now I'm cutting off the edges, which I'll actually save. We have one bin in the walk-in that's basically an accumulation of the edges from basically 2 or 3 days. Since this is sourdough, it can live for a while, and we'll accumulate it and make it into what turns into cinnamon roll dough, or we can make garlic knots. We can make so many things with extra English muffin dough. It's truly one of our most exceptional doughs for its versatility. Kind of watching to see whether there's any snapback, and typically any accumulated tension will stay towards the center, so you'll see more of a snapback in the center of the sheet than towards the edges. Now that all of these are cut out, they're ready to immediately go on the trays. Just gonna move some of this flour out of my way so it doesn't create an unnecessary mess. And I'll use the edge of this table for the first sheet tray. For full-size sheet trays, we find that 24 of these bake quite well together. You can see that there's some flour left over, but compared to the amount of flour that I actually used, most of it is now just absorbed. Seems like a good amount though. The dough isn't really, for the most part, sticking to the table. If it was hard to pick the dough up, that would be a good indicator that it was also sticking to the table while I was trying to roll it thinner. It's kind of counterproductive. You also don't want so much flour on the table so that the bottom of your English muffins are full of flour. I'm kind of feeling and making sure that the amount of flour on the underside is not an excess amount that has no chance of actually being accepted into the dough. These are my slightly smaller ones that did kind of stretch, and they will come out smaller as a result once they've done that. So, you know, if we have a pretty big discrepancy, then we can always mark down a bag. We're making all these by hand, so we're packaging all these by hand, so it's not that big of a deal to write, you know, whatever discount off on the bag for a few. Of course, you don't want that to be happening an exceptional amount, because then you're going to just lose product to that even. But out of 120, if I have 1 or 2 packs of smaller muffins that I need to mark off $1, I still think that that's fairly acceptable. Okay, these are all set. Basically gonna bring them right back to the walk-in where I found this rack originally. I mentioned that we had one bin with some scraps of English muffin doughs that we were accumulating. I'm going to add the scraps to it. I'm going to kind of fold the dough on top of it so that it just becomes a part of a singular mass of dough. That's to be addressed later today. So now this is kind of the workstation post English muffins. English muffins create a messier workstation. What I don't want is to see all this flour start to track all around the rest of the building over the next hour or two. So if I have a moment, it actually makes sense to take 5 minutes or so to reset this workstation before I continue, especially before I flip those English muffins over there. That's what I'm going to do. Trying to figure out actually what's making these guys stick to these pans. We didn't really have this issue in the garage, and so we think it might be a combination of things. For one, a lot of new sheet pans that have been used less times, so they're basically smoother finishes, and the dough has basically a smoother finish to adhere to if it happens to be sticky. So the other thing is perhaps we're not using enough semolina, but I feel like it's still sticking even though we've consciously said, okay, we're gonna use more semolina. The other potential reasons for the stickiness are because perhaps the heat distribution in the oven, which would be something that would be harder to solve for. The most likely culprit is the fact that the dough is just ever so slightly different as a result of our slightly different feeding routines of the sourdough starter. So likely compared to previous iterations of English muffins, this dough is slightly more wet, and that few percentage points of more hydration is all that it's taking to create a different adherence to the pans during the baking. So we'll solve it like, you know, most other things. Just, you know, it needs to be solved in its course of time. We started just the simplest possible solution, adding more semolina. Obviously that hasn't worked, so we're gonna see, gotta look further into the formula and see what we need to adjust in it. The problem with this is like it's just, the muffins overall have been coming out nicely, so it's a minor nuisance to the baker, and it takes a minute for that feedback loop to make it around the bakery, because it's not like this is derived from a customer complaint on the English muffins. And so this baker, in this case me, needs to remember to, you know, talk about it with mixers in particular, and there's often higher priorities, so I just forget about it. Although the sticky English muffins make me feel like I'm just making these for the first time. They like really kind of take away from the rhythm of the baking. Okay, so now 6 minutes in. And we'll have another batch of English muffins. And we'll basically keep this cycle going most of the morning until all the English muffins that I need to bake for production this weekend are done. They cool off, and then they have to get bagged. So it takes them a few hours before they can cool off, so there's no more moisture, and then we put them in bags, and they make it on the delivery truck.